Hello. Okay, I think the universe doesn't want me to finish this topic because I keep having technical problems. All right, let's move on to the Neshoba colony, which is another example of a utopian community in early American history. This is a little bit later than the Shakers. It was founded in the 1800s. But it was also founded by a woman named Frances Wright, who was a Scottish immigrant who came to the U.S. and got very interested in the anti-slavery movement. And she helped to found the Neshoba colony in Tennessee. So the Neshoba colony also looked at men and women as more equal, like the Shakers. And it was an experiment in interracial living. Remember, she was an abolitionist. So what they would do in the Neshoba colony is they would buy slaves and bring them into the Neshoba colony, and they would educate the slaves, and then they would pay them for their work so that they could earn money to buy their freedom. And then the freed slaves would remain in the Neshoba colony, and it was a community of black and white residents, and it became a community of free black residents because many of them bought their freedom. Now, another unique thing about the Neshoba colony is they believed in something that Wright called free love. They believed that everyone should equally choose their romantic partner. And they did believe in monogamy. So they did believe that you dedicate yourself to one person and you practice monogamy, but outside of marriage. So there were people in the Neshoba colony who were committed to each other, but who didn't actually legally marry. They lived together without the marriage license. Now, I know today that doesn't sound very controversial, but back in the 1800s, this was a very controversial idea. And so the Neshoba colony is another one of these experimental communities of the 1800s that looked at men and women's gender roles differently and marriage differently. Okay, the last utopian society that I'm going to cover in the 1800s is the Oneida community. So the Oneida community was founded by a man named John Humphrey Noyes. And it was first founded in Vermont, but it was later moved to New York. And part of the reason why they moved to New York was because they were a very controversial group. Like a lot of utopian communities, they were looking at life differently than average Americans were. This is a plaque from the family home of John Noyes in Vermont, where he grew up. And again, he was from Vermont, but the Oneida community later moved to upstate New York. So who was John Humphrey Noyes? Noyes was a preacher, a Christian preacher. And he began to preach his ideas in the 1830s. And he was also worried about the new millennium, kind of like Mother Ann Lee, except he was worried about the year 1900 coming up because it was the mid-1800s. And he believed that unless people strove to live without sin, that the world would end in 1900. And so he was going to set up a community that was without sin. And it was going to become a model for the rest of the world to follow. So Noyes had an interesting view of marriage, like many utopian communities did. He didn't believe in celibacy, like the Shakers. And he didn't believe in monogamy, like the Neshoba colony. He believed in what we would call today group marriage. And this was one of the reasons why he had to leave Vermont, because this was a very controversial idea for the time period. Noyes advocated that men and women can freely choose their romantic partners, but a legal marriage was not necessary to one person, and he believed a group of people could be in a marriage together. You could have a marriage with more than one person. And he did advocate birth control, but there were very few birth control options for this time. So he advocated birth control by interrupting intercourse. Now, the other unique thing about the United community in the beginning was that they believed that children should be raised by the community, not by the biological parents. And so in the Oneida community, they set up child care centers with a dorm. And once you were over the age of 3 years old, you would sleep and live in the child care center, and the adults would take turns staying in the child care center, taking care of the community children. So after the age of 3, you're really not living in the house with your parents or with your biological parents. You're living and being raised by the community. So that's my dog barking. Now, Noyes had to flee to Canada in 1879 because he was being charged with committing adultery. That was a law back then. And he ended up dying in Canada in the 1880s. Now, one of the things that came out of the Oneida community later was they founded a silver works factory that became a corporation after Noyes left the country. Some of you in your house right now might have Oneida silverware or Oneida utensils. The Oneida company is still in existence today. And as late as the 1990s, there were still people, descendants of the original community, that were still working at the Oneida Silverworks Company. The Oneida Company was really one of the first employee-owned companies in the U.S., meaning that the workers split the profits evenly. So that was a new idea for this time period, and they were ahead of their times in that way. So all of these utopian communities that I've talked about in these videos challenge the idea that women should stay in the private sphere and challenge the idea that women couldn't be leaders. All right, I want to discuss the beginning of the women's rights movement, and this will be the last topic I cover before I end this video. So the women's rights movement, which in the beginning was known as the suffrage movement because they focused on getting women the right to vote, really began in the early 1840s. As I mentioned in an earlier video, many women were part of the anti-slavery movement, and that was controversial, but there were many, many women in the North, in the U.S., that were very active in the anti-slavery movement. Now, anti-slavery was a movement that didn't just happen in the U.S. There was an anti-slavery movement in other countries, and England had an anti-slavery movement by the 1840s. There were many nations that still allowed for slavery. So there was a world movement to end slavery worldwide. So in 1840, there was a world organization called the World Anti-Slavery Society, and they decided to hold a convention in London, England. And abolitionists from around the world went to London to debate how can the world be rid of slavery. And there were many American abolitionists that went on a boat over to London, to England, to take part in this convention. There were women from America who went to the convention because women were active abolitionists and they wanted to partake in the convention. Two American women who attended the World Anti-Slavery Convention in London was Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. Now, Lucretia Mott was a Quaker. I'm going to get into the Quaker Church later. But she was a very active abolitionist. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was also an active abolitionist with her husband. She was a newlywed, and their honeymoon was to get on a ship and go over to London to participate in this convention. So when they arrived at the convention organizers told the women that they were not allowed to participate in the discussions. They had to sit behind a curtain and listen to the men debate slavery. And that angered Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and because they felt like second-class citizens. And they became friends, and they started talking, and they said, you know, we need a women's rights movement not just an anti-slavery movement in the U.S. That's the seed that planted what became known as the women's rights movement, the suffrage movement. Now, it took them 8 years, but in 1848, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and other activists organized the Seneca Falls Convention in Seneca Falls, New York, not far from here. It's a couple hours north of here. And they invited delegates, men and women, to talk about women gaining equality in society. 300 delegates, again, men and women, went to Seneca Falls, New York, and over several days they met to talk about women's rights. They wrote a document called the Declaration of Sentiments, which is based on the Declaration of Independence. And it said all men and women are created equal. And it listed rights they felt women deserve. So one of the things they listed was that married women should have the right to own property separate from their husbands. Back in this time, if you were a married woman, all of whatever you owned that you brought into the marriage was your husband's property. You didn't even have the right over deciding what happens with your children. That was your husband's decisions. And so that was one of the important things they listed. Now, they did list the right to vote, and I want to talk about the issue of women's suffrage or the right to vote, which was a controversial issue. There were delegates at Seneca Falls who did not think the right to vote should have been added to the Declaration of Sentiments. Now, why, you might wonder? Well, there were people there like Lucretia Mott who were Quakers. Quakers were an English religion that eventually came over to the American colonies. And the Quakers believed, in God's eyes, men and women are equal, kind of like the Shakers. And they did not believe in hierarchy. In other words, they did not believe that in society, some people should have more power than other people. So in the Quaker religion, there isn't a minister, because that would mean that one person would have more power over the rest of the people. They don't believe in electing officials to serve in government either. So they didn't vote because they didn't believe in giving some people more power than others. So the Quakers at Seneca Falls didn't want to add the right to vote to the Declaration of Sentiments because they didn't vote. So that was a big debate in Seneca Falls. One of the delegates, Frederick Douglass, who I've mentioned before, he was the abolitionist who was a former slave. Just ignore my dog. Okay, I've mentioned Frederick Douglass before. He was a black abolitionist. He became a well-known speaker and writer on the issue of anti-slavery. He also was in favor of women's rights. That is often forgotten about when you look at the history of Frederick Douglass. But Frederick Douglass was at Seneca Falls, and he got up to speak. And he spoke in favor of adding the right to vote to the Declaration of Sentiments. So here's a quote he said at the Seneca Falls Conference. He said, "We hold women to be justly entitled to all we claim for men. We go farther and express our conviction that all political rights, which it is expected for man to exercise, it is equally so for women." So what his argument was is that if women don't have the right to vote, they will never be equal in American society. So the right to vote has to be added to the Declaration of Sentiments. That has to be a goal of the women's rights movement. And that did convince the delegates to add the right to vote to the Declaration of Sentiments. So he played a key role in convincing the delegates to fight for the right to vote. That document was published, and that began to bring people into the suffrage movement, which is the first focus of the women's rights movement. And more men and women began to join the suffrage movement in the Age of Association. Of all the people who were at the Seneca Falls Convention, I think only one lived to see women get the right to vote in 1920. Now, a famous suffragist was Susan B. Anthony. She had been a teacher and a reformer in the Age of Association. She was involved in the anti-slavery movement, the temperance movement, but after 1853, she began to focus mainly on women's rights, and she became close friends with Elizabeth Cady Stanton. This is a famous photograph of Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Here's Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. So they became good friends and they worked on the suffrage movement together. However, not all suffragists were white women or white men. As I mentioned, Frederick Douglass, an African American, was an active women's rights advocate. There also were African American women who were part of the suffrage movement, and one of the most famous African American suffragists and abolitionists was Sojourner Truth. Sojourner Truth was born a slave in Ulster County, New York, not far from Sullivan, to a Dutch family. Her birth name was Isabella, and she later escaped, and when New York banned slavery in 1827, she became free because she was born in New York. She was very, very religious, and she spoke out about her Christian beliefs. In the 1840s, she changed her name to Sojourner Truth because she believed that God was calling her to speak the truth to people. And she traveled all around the North, and she was part of the anti-slavery movement. She spoke about her own slave experience. She was friends with many other famous abolitionists at the time, like Frederick Douglass. And she became a very well-known public speaker. She's remembered for giving powerful speeches that really moved people. And a lot of people forget that she also was a big advocate for women's rights. So she was speaking at a women's rights convention in Ohio when she gave the following quote. She said, "I have heard much about the sexes being equal. I can carry as much as any man, and I can eat as much too if I can get it. I am as strong as any man that is now. As far as intellect, all I can say is, if a woman have a pint and a man a quart, why can't she have her little pint full?" So that was one of her statements about why she felt women should be equal to men. She felt she could do the same work as men and had the same intellect as men. And so she didn't see any reason why men and women shouldn't be treated equally. So we're going to be talking a lot about the suffrage movement this semester because it was a 70-plus year fight to get women the right to vote, and it's not something that's going to happen overnight. It's going to be something we're going to talk about in future videos. So that's where I'll leave this video. I'll see you in the next one.